Hey everyone, welcome to another top 10 list. This week's top 10 list is definitely one I don't think I've done before. This is going to be my top 10 specimen and experimental notes. So that's something you don't see too often. Top 10 experimental or specimen notes. And these are notes that I've collected. You're not necessarily going to find a book value for them anywhere. Doesn't change the price that they are what they are. They're specimens. They're the example that was sent out to banks so that banks would know what to look for, or these were done to show the government what a particular company could do if they chose them to do the printing work. So, yeah, it's a whole little subgenre of collecting. And, well, of course, I've got about 10, so that's good enough for me to make a list. Let's get started. Number 10 this week. This is a specimen note, and it's a specimen for a traveler's check. This one happens to be the National Westminster Bank Limited specimen. And what's cool about this one is it's not a $10 check. It is good for 10 pounds. So it is a specimen from a different currency than US currency, and it's not a dollar, it's a different, I don't want to say denomination, but a different representation of their cash, pounds instead of dollars. So yeah, it's always neat to have a specimen that has some worldwide pull to it, I guess you could say. Taking a look at the back, the coloring on the back, going from the brown to the orange to the blue to the green, pretty cool looking on there for a security feature. The $10 specimen from the National Westminster Bank Limited. That is number 10 on the list. Number 9. This is a web note. A web note was an experimental note done in the late 80s and early 90s. You can find these from the 1988A, 1993, and 1995 series. What they did was imagine how you envision a newspaper being printed with a continuous roll of paper going through a gigantic press at high speed. Well, that press that they were using is called a web-fed press because the way the paper goes through there, they said it's like a spider web, so they called it a web-fed press. And they decided they were going to try to print US currency using the web-fed press, which means you had a continuous roll of paper going through this rather than the sheets like we use today. So to identify a web note, one of the experimental notes, the easiest thing is just to look right here. If you've got one solitary little number, that's the plate number. That indicates that this is a web note. If it says FW, that would be Fort Worth. That's not a web note. If there is a letter over here next to that number, that letter indicates the section of the sheet that the note was on. This wasn't on a section of a sheet, so it shouldn't have a number. In this section here, they would have the actual position number. It would be a letter and a number, P or a D4, for instance, or it would say, anything up to H, H1. But you can see here there is no designation here, so it has no position number. And the other way to identify a web note is on the back plate is next to "In God We Trust." Normally that would be down here, but to see it up top, that identifies it as a web note. This particular one's been graded 64 EPQ, choice uncirculated, by PMG. I'm guessing it got the 64 because of the centering, because the rest of the note is in really good shape. And for those of you, like I said in many of my videos, if you think a note is an error because it's off-center, no, it's worth less. Here's the example. A note being off-center does not increase the value. It technically decreases the value because it's off. It's not the way it should be. Anyway, that one is number 9, a web-fed press note. Number 8. This is from the American Banknote Company. The American Banknote Company decided they wanted to have another shot at printing notes. They printed our notes in the 1800s. They printed many of the notes for obsolete banknotes, but this particular one was what they were trying to do. They wanted to show the U.S. government what they could do with their printing presses. So they designed this $10 specimen note. They put a series of 1929 on there, even though this isn't from 1929. You can see it says specimen here, here. It's a 10. It doesn't say dollar because that would be counterfeit. And it's interesting because they used green ink on the front and they used black ink on the back. Once again, it was a specimen to show what they were capable of. You can see it says American Banknote Company on it right there. And the vast majority of these have what are known as wheel marks. This one here is green, this one's black. You can see the green and the black here. It has to do with ink getting on the wheels that would push the paper through. So you'd have those wheel marks all over on most of these notes. Now, if you take this note out of the sleeve, you can actually feel the ink on the paper, which makes these just so cool to have in hand. So that one is number 8, the American Banknote Company $10 specimen. Number 7, I got this from my friend Dennis. Dennis sent me this, and I really appreciate this. It's one of the cooler specimens that I have. It is a United States $1,000 traveler's check. And when you look, it is just so cool. Now, when you run your finger across, you can feel the printing on there. I mean, it's just such a neat note. It looks like it's printed on the page. It's not. The note is glued to the page. You can see here how it's glued in there. But it's a specimen note. And what I always found interesting was the denomination. This is a $1,000 traveler's check. Well, the whole point of having traveler's checks was so that you wouldn't have to carry cash. So you would try to get traveler's checks in denominations you would be spending. For instance, you would get $20 traveler's checks if you figured your average bill was going to be in the $20 range. That way you could spend the $20 traveler's check and get a buck or two in change wherever you were going. But to have $1,000, that implies that you were spending $1,000 at a time. I mean, think about it. If your bill was $80 and you paid with a $1,000 traveler's check, you'd be getting $920 in real change back. Well, if you were going to have $920 in real money, why did you get a traveler's check? It doesn't make sense. So to see a $1,000 traveler's check, definitely a rare thing. This one is from Thomas Cook Traveler's Checks. So being a $1,000 specimen is just a fascinating note and definitely has to make my list. That one is number 7. Number 6, we are going to go with this one here. This is a fractional currency specimen. You can see the FR number has SP for specimen. It's the 3rd issue, and it's the back plate specimen note, graded choice new 63, apparent small edge tear at the left. Looking at this note, how do I know it's a specimen? If I turn it over, it says specimen. You can pretty much see through this one. I'm not sure. I think this might even just be able to see through it because it's so heavily embossed. I don't think that's a wet ink transfer on there. Maybe it is. I'm not sure. I can't tell because it's in the grading sleeve and I can't take it out of there. The 25-cent 3rd series. Now, this one is known as the narrow example. The narrow example, they're referring to the border. I know there's not really a border, but that's the point. It's not. There isn't a border. That's why it's known as the narrow. Specimens like this, they can be a few $100. So to have this one graded by PMG, that's pretty cool. That one is number 6. Number 5 goes hand in hand. It is the back specimen red ink 3rd issue 25-cent back specimen fractional currency. This, like I said, looking at that, you can see here, once again, you can see all the ink through it, but it does say specimen as well. This one is known as the wide. Now, the wide specimens are worth quite a bit more. The reasoning for that is because of the extra paper. This is much bigger than the actual note was, whereas this one is the size of the note itself. So there were fewer of these made, And the way you want to keep track of that is, if the narrow was worth more, then you would simply take every wide you ever found and cut it down to be a narrow. Well, common sense says if you cut down all of the wides to be narrows, then there aren't going to be any more wides. That's why the wide is worth more. There just aren't any. There's a lot fewer wides, and you cannot make more by cut like you can with a narrow. The narrow, you can cut the border to make it narrow, and if you do that, now you're just destroying the actual value. This is the one that has the bigger value. So the Specimen from the fractional currency series. That is number 5. Number 4, I pulled out my 1935A experimental S silver certificate. This one here has been graded 64 EPQ. Beautiful, beautiful note. This is the experimental note where they tried to change the coating that was put on the paper. Our notes are not paper, I should say that. Our notes are actually cloth. They're a 75-25 blend of cotton and linen, and it's very difficult to print on cotton and linen. So they have to put some type of coating on the paper for the ink to stick. So yes, there is a coating, and they did an experiment to try to change that coating. So what they did was they made notes that had the special coating on the notes, and they put this bright red S on them. Take a look at the back. You can see this one's really nice. Anyway, the special coating got an S, and people, the plan was to put these notes out in circulation and then recall them after a certain period of time to see if they wore, if they would wear any less or any more than the original notes. The experiment failed because everybody saw the bright red S. Nobody bothered to spend the notes. They tried to save them all. They saved all of the S's, and very, very few of them actually came back. So the experiment was a failure. They never got any results. This is the S note from that experiment, and that is number 4. And let's see. Number 3 on the list would be the R note from the same experiment. The R note is the regular note. This note is no different than any other silver certificate, but it was part of the experiment, so they stamped it with the red R. This way, when the experiment concluded, they could simply recall all the R's and the S's and compare the wear on the R's versus the S's. Once again, they weren't returned, so they were there wasn't much that they could do as far as verifying what wore better or worse. The thing is that everybody knew the S notes were special, and everybody also knew the R notes weren't. Well, are you going to save a special note, or are you going to save a regular note? Exactly. Everybody saved the special notes, which means the R notes are actually harder to find. So the R notes are worth more. The regular note of the experiment is actually worth more than the specials, because there are so many more of these that survived. So yeah, you obviously want to get the pair. When you have them, you want them in similar condition. That way you yourself can compare the two notes accurately. But yeah, these are both 64s. That's the way to get them, with similar conditions. So that is number 3. What do I got now? Number 2. I have a bunch of the Giori test notes. Now, the Giori test notes, this was done with a new type of press that was allowed to do intaglio printing on 2 different colors at the same time. The experimental notes, the test notes, were only done with a single color, and there's a few different kinds. There's this one here, which is the back plate, is what it's considered. And it has what's known as the grass green front. So the green ink here, this was actually, they used actual plates, real plates, for the test process. And because they used real plates, technically these are counterfeit notes. In 1996, these were designated as collectibles. And these, of course, are blank on the back. This one is the most common version that you're going to find. Now, there's a front version, which shows 3 different presidents. This one's a 65. This one's got Lincoln, it's got Washington, and it's got Grant. And this particular one, you can see, is also blank on the back. There are occasions where you will find notes like this that have the back, this portion on it. So and that's pretty cool. But this is probably the second most common that you're going to find. This one is interesting to me, particularly because of the size of the note itself. If I line up the top of the note with the top of this one, you'll see that this bottom note is wider. It's miscut. It's like the bottom of the page, and they just didn't bother. In fact, there's actually the print line where they should have cut it, but they didn't. So I always found that interesting. And then the other Giori note, this one has Thomas Jefferson pictured. And this is the rare one. This is the harder one to come by, the one with Jefferson. As far as the front plates go, it still has Lincoln and it still has Grant, but the one with Jefferson in the middle, that one's a little tougher. This one also has the mud brown ink on it. And this one also has a back printing. And the back printing on this one is done in black ink. So this particular one, this one's up there. I bet you this is in the $700 range, probably. Graded in that condition with all of those variables. The only one that would be even more rare is the one that includes a serial number right here. That is the rarest and most expensive. So the Giori test notes, those are number 2 on my list. And finally, number 1 this week. It's another fractional specimen. You can see here FR 1330A SP. The SP represents specimen. You can see it does say the spinner face specimen fractional currency. This one's graded choice about new 58 apparent edge tear at the bottom left. I'm not even concerned about that. What I am concerned about is this one being a specimen. The way I know it's a specimen, aside from it being in a case, is there is no back printing on it. Another thing you're going to notice is this here, the bleed through of the ink, because on this specimen, Spinner actually signed it. You can see how the ink is starting to, there's the orange around the ink there, that little bit of bleed from the rust. It was also signed by the Register of the Treasury as well. So this specimen note is actually signed by Spinner. It's his real autograph. That is just beyond cool. Part of the printing press of this is, part of the printing process of this is this portion here. You can see how it is then duplicated underneath. And that is done in bronzing powder. What they did was they printed the exact same thing right here in glue and then sprinkled bronzing powder on both sides. And that's why it has that metallic look to it. Considering this is from the 1860s, I mean, that is so impressive. The note is impressive. The fact that it's a specimen is impressive. And the fact that it's actually signed by Spinner this has had to be number 1 without a doubt. All right, if you learned anything new this week, go ahead and hit that like button. If you like what you see and you want to see more, please subscribe. Love reading all your comments. Guys, thanks for watching. I'll talk to you next week.